Everything and everyone we like, dislike, do avoid, believe, dismiss can be explained in terms of maintaining dopamine flow. Nothing else matters. Human behavior seems inexplicable and complex because there are so many ways to trigger dopamine. Some use drugs and gambling. Others trigger dopamine with belief systems, money, or the dopamine-induced survival behaviors humans share with chimpanzees that Abraham Maslow identified and called deficiency needs for food, sex, safety, power, acceptance, approval, attention, esteem, status. To confuse matters, the same dopamine can keep, for example, 6 people either refusing to enter an airplane or agreeing to skydive for 6 different reasons. For one, avoiding air travel might be dopamine-induced claustrophobia that keeps her out of elevators. For another, who can't travel in a car unless he's behind the wheel, a lack of control. For a third, a paralyzing fear of dying while landing. The fourth might agree to skydive, despite being more afraid of dying than the third, because he's much more afraid of being mocked and rejected by macho peers than dying. The fifth's motivation involves dopamine-inducing expectations of winning approval and inflating esteem through braggadocio, while the sixth gladly jump as often as she can thank dopamine squirts triggered by expectations of incredible excitement. Most people prefer to believe human behavior is too complex to understand because the esteem-elevating conceit triggers dopamine, whereas accepting the possibility all behavior can be explained in terms of maintaining dopamine flow threatens dopamine flow by threatening safety and esteem and acceptance. Approval for those with the temerity to suggest such a heretical concept. I'm convinced the most dangerous and destructive addicts to use money, power, and esteem to trigger the same dopamine junkies trigger with heroin. The difference is that junkies get arrested while money, power, esteem addicts get away with flaunting favorite dopamine triggers while pretending their addictions are normal, acceptable, and even admirable customs and behaviors. The reason for this is the money, power, esteem addicts control the institutions determining the definition of addictions. I'm not suggesting a conscious conspiracy. Addicts are driven by unconscious dopamine-induced cravings for control, power, money, approval, status. Honesty that threatens dopamine flow is the last thing addicts are interested in. In other words, our species is suffering from the perfect pandemic. A brain disease capable of keeping sufferers from wanting to know we're suffering from a brain disease. Why? Because the facts are a huge threat to safety, peer approval, and esteem equals huge threat to dopamine flow. Nothing else matters, not even the fate of our species. Ironically, nice and normal types, who can't admit to benign addictions, make it possible for miscreants driven by malignant addictions to money, power, status to continue getting away with wholesale destruction. How could anything so obvious sound so ridiculous? 19th century doctors were incensed by the suggestion they were killing women while refusing to do something as simple as washing their hands to prove Ignaz Semmelweis wrong. Why? They weren't interested in facts, truth, finding out they were wrong, or even saving expectant mothers and innocent babies' lives because the only thing they cared about was maintaining the same dopamine flow, keeping today's researchers from waking up and smelling how powerful dopamine really is. Dopamine is so powerful it's capable of keeping today's scientists from wanting to understand they're suffering from the same affliction that kept yesteryear's experts from accepting heliocentrism, and medical doctors from washing their hands. At this point, I'm used to being dismissed, humored, lambasted, and scoffed at, especially since what I've learned about dopamine explains why so few are open to accepting what I consider obvious. In the same way that it doesn't make sense to expect heroin addicts to heed logical arguments to give up heroin, I don't expect safety, power, acceptance, approval, and esteem addicts to embrace ideas that threaten their dopamine flow. Humankind's greatest weaknesses, greed, ego, selfishness, consumerism, etc., can all be traced to addictions to the dopamine-induced survival needs we share with chimpanzees. The symptoms for all addictions include self-deception and denial, a lack of free will, and an obsessive commitment to maintaining dopamine flow. We're all, to varying degrees, addicted to power, fear, safety, peer approval, attention, esteem, status, money, or belief systems because they all happen to trigger dopamine. Few are interested in considering the above because the facts increase fears and reduce esteem equals cut dopamine flow. Dopamine is so powerful that, for most, passing up a chance to trigger dopamine, or risking learning anything that remotely threatens dopamine flow, simply aren't options. Dopamine was the reason it took centuries to notice the obvious physical and behavioral similarities between Homo sapiens and chimpanzees and decades for a majority to accept Copernicus' insights into heliocentrism. Dopamine is the reason contemporary researchers aren't tripping over one another to use fMRIs to connect all of humankind's weaknesses and problems to dopamine-induced power, fear, safety, peer approval, attention, esteem, status, money, and/or religious addictions. The power, money addicts, currently squandering their short time on Earth destroying a planet that gave them life, do what they do to score the same neurotransmitter junkies trigger with heroin. The biggest difference between power, money addicts and junkies is that the power, money addicts are more dangerous. Plus, they control the definition of addictions. So while junkies have to hide their needles and get arrested, power, money addicts are free to flaunt their dopamine triggers and get away with murder.